2005, that term took on a slightly negative connotation, especially in the Python web community. It came to mean a library which would distort your code into some weird shape you didn't want it to be in. And web frameworks, after all, the ones that kind of gave it this bad name, don't really implement a lot of functionality for you. They kind of choose a good shape for your code, and if that shape's the right shape, it makes a lot of your work easier. So there's a different word which kind of more accurately describes Twisted that we use these days, which is engine. Because you talk about web frameworks, but you talk about graphics engines. And graphics engines also require you to structure your program in a particular way. But graphics engines and networking engines like Twisted are more than just structure. There's a lot of functionality which is kind of hard to implement. So that's why today, Twisted is the engine of your internet. But I'm not just going to tell you that Twisted does a lot. I'm going to show you some of the stuff that it does. So here are some of the things that Twisted can do. I'm going to show you how to make every one of these servers with a one-line shell command. And each one of these is backed up by a library that you can call into with regular Python code. Now, you can feel free to follow along the shell. I'm going to try hard to keep these commands short, clear, to give you enough time to type them in. I'm also going to try to give the version which can be stopped with Control-C in your terminal, with the -n flag, meaning you don't daemonize. So you should be able to run it, Control-C, move on to the next one. Not all these examples are directly amenable to that, and don't feel bad if you miss a couple. So I'll give you a moment to get it prompted up and ready with Twisted or whatever. And while you're doing that, always remember the most important option. This is kind of a universal truth. It's not specific to Twisted. There are two different ways you can use this in Twisted. You can call twistd-help, which just tells you all about all the different plugins that Twisted ships with. Or you can do twisty some plugin name --help, which will give you help on that particular plugin. And this is important because the command line options for different plugins, if they do so much different stuff, are really very different. So, starting off with everybody's favorite protocol, HTTP. The web server in Twisted is called Twisted Web. This here runs a web server. It runs on port 8080. It will serve static files and dynamic content out of the current directory, which is what that dot at the end means there. There are other modes that you can run the Twisted web server in, though. For example, I mentioned earlier that Twisted and Django integrate. They don't have to fight. If you want to run a WSGI application with Twisted, you just pass --WSGI on the command line. And unlike Apache, this takes no configuration to get started. This is not like looking at a hidden configuration file that's a big, giant default full of comments in some directory you're not looking at. This is really it. This is the full configuration for the Twisted web server. Unlike the other alternative which is like that, for example, the Django development server, it's a real web server with lots of other features. You can use it in production. Lots of people do. TwistedMatrix.com does. Plenty of other sites do. So it's not like a toy that you can only use for development. You can start off with this and you can scale up with it. And again, because it's a library, you can use the same code, but invoke it in a totally different way, completely customize how it gets set up and run. Now for an IRC server. IRC server is part of the multi-protocol Twisted instant messaging package, Twisted Words, which is why that is the command line. So this is an IRC server that listens on 6667, which is the default IRC port. It authenticates a single user, me, with the password PW. I had to kind of squish together a slide there, you can probably tell. And has a single channel, which is my group, or hash my group. This here indicates the port number. Notice the TCP colon. That could be something else. For example, SSL colon, which would run the same server over SSL. And the reason I chose TCP, obviously, is if you're doing SSL, you have to put a ton more stuff into that argument, like where your certificates are, those kinds of things. But you only have to where you can spell that out anywhere that takes what's called a stir ports description in Twisted. You can pass several different types of listening endpoint you can accept connections on. And TCP and SSL are the most popular ones, but there's some exciting stuff coming up in the new version of Twisted that has not been released yet, which will add some more of those. This next option is specifies the authentication plugin. Unfortunately, due to time constraints, I'm not going to talk about Twisted Cred today, but that's an API you should look at if you're interested in deploying services that authenticate people with Twisted. This uses the memory plugin, which is just a string with colon-separated usernames and passwords. I've got one of those. There are other authentication plugins, obviously, which look at, for example, a file full of usernames and passwords, or a hashed file full of usernames and passwords. There's also an API for adding more. So you could, for example, have an IRC user in this server for every shell user on your system. And in fact, one of the things we wrote for the lab after this talk is an authentication plugin which allows any password, and that will be in the solutions tarball that you can download later. So you can see how that will be done. And finally, this creates a chat group. If you want to create multiple groups, you can just pass the -- group option over and over again for however many groups you want. Or, again, this is a front end for a Python library. If you don't like super long command lines with hundreds of -- group options, you can just go and write an IRC server of your own. Next up, a DNS server. A DNS server in Twisted is part of the Twisted Names package. This here runs a DNS server on 5553. Be careful, by the way, if you're customizing the port number. If you know DNS, you know the default port number is 53, which is of course privileged, and you can't run without being root. 5353 is MDNS though, so if you try that, you'll get some conflict errors. But this runs a DNS server serving domains out of a file in the format of /etc/hosts. Now, if any of you have ever administered a bind server, you know that you have to learn the zone file syntax and a bunch of other stuff about carrying for and feeding the actual bind daemon itself. This is kind of an example of how Twisted is not just not complicated, but ridiculously simple. You can just take a hosts file, which is IP name, stick it in a directory, and you're doing DNS. And Twisted has a fully functional DNS server. So, and it provides a bunch of other options too, for different ways you can specify that. If you want a Python file that contains some hosts that you want to be able to look up, you can use the PyZone option. Now, I said you could follow along and type these commands in. Probably typing in a PyZone on the fly is a little bit tricky. But if you look at the documentation for Twisted Names, you'll see the format. It's a very simple collection of Python objects that you can just call to build up DNS zone. And finally, not only is Twisted simple, it can also just replace a lot of your existing daemons. You can use bind format zone files if you've already got one lying around. So if you have bind running, you can, for the most part, there's some features that bind has that Twisted Names doesn't, but you can, for a lot of simple configurations, you can just get rid of bind, take your existing data,